The crystalline halls of the Galactic Tribunal echoed with the clicking of 1,000 chitinous feet as spectators filed into their designated viewing chambers. Above them, the three-headed magistrate Vexthul adjusted his ceremonial robes, each head wearing a different expression of predetermined judgment. Today's trial was meant to be a formality, another example to keep the lesser species in line. In the defendant's cage, suspended 20 feet above the courtroom floor, Kretok of the Solari hunched his 6 shoulders in defeat. His blue-scaled hide had lost its natural luminescence weeks ago, dulled by the neural dampeners that prevented any telepathic communication with his kind. The charges against him were severe: sedition, conspiracy against the hegemony, and worst of all, inspiring hope among the subjugated worlds. The defendant will state his designation for the record, announced the central head of Magistrate Vexthul, while the left head yawned and the right head examined its claws with boredom. Kretok, son of Murtak of the mining world Solaris Prime, the defendant replied, his voice barely above a whisper through the translation matrix. Prosecutor Zalthan, a towering insectoid with mandibles that clicked rhythmically, rose from his position. Honored Magistrate, the evidence is overwhelming. The defendant organized 17 separate work stoppages across the Solari mining operations, distributed seditious materials questioning the hegemony's divine right to rule, and most grievously, convinced his people that they deserved what the humans called dignity. A collective hiss rose from the gallery. The very concept was considered a dangerous infection spread by humanity, a species that had somehow resisted total subjugation despite their technological inferiority. Furthermore, Zalthan continued, he was found in possession of this. The prosecutor held up a small worn booklet, a human document titled Declaration of Universal Rights, clearly evidence of contamination by human ideology. Magistrate Vexthul's 3 heads conferred briefly before the center head spoke. The court recognizes the severity of these charges. Does the defendant have representation? The courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew that no respectable advocate would dare defend a case involving human concepts. It would be career suicide at best, actual suicide at worst. I will represent the defendant. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the source of the voice. A figure stepped forward from the back of the chamber, bipedal, relatively small, with the distinctive pink-tan skin of a human. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the gallery. State your credentials, demanded the magistrate, all 3 heads now focused intently on the newcomer. Captain Sarah Chen, former legal officer of the Terran Defense Force, currently serving as humanitarian liaison under the Treaty of Centauri. I invoke Article 15 of said treaty, which grants me the right to represent any being whose case involves human cultural contamination. Prosecutor Zalthan's mandibles clicked frantically. This is highly irregular. A human cannot. Article 15 is binding, Chen interrupted, her voice cutting through the prosecutor's protests like a laser through tissue paper. Unless the magistrate wishes to void the treaty and face the consequences of restarting hostilities with humanity. The 3 heads of Vexthul whispered urgently among themselves. The Treaty of Centauri had ended a brutal 3-year war that had cost the hegemony more ships and soldiers than they cared to admit. Despite humanity's technological disadvantages, their tenacity and unpredictability had made them too costly to fully conquer. The court recognizes the human's right to represent the defendant, the center head finally announced with obvious reluctance. Chen approached the defendant's cage, looking up at Kretok with compassionate eyes. Don't lose hope, she said quietly. That's what they fear most about us. That hope is contagious. The trial proceeded with Prosecutor Zalthan presenting his evidence with theatrical flourish. Video recordings of work stoppages, intercepted communications discussing fair treatment, testimonies from hegemony overseers about decreased productivity. Each piece of evidence was damning under current hegemony law. When called to present her defense, Chen stood slowly. Honored Magistrate, I don't dispute the facts as presented. Kretok did organize work stoppages. He did distribute materials questioning the current system. He did teach his people that they had worth beyond their labor output. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Kretok looked confused. His defender seemed to be confirming his guilt. However, Chen continued, her voice growing stronger, I challenge the legitimacy of the laws under which he's being prosecuted. Outrageous. Zal then buzzed. The defendant cannot challenge hegemony law. I'm not challenging hegemony law, Chen replied with a slight smile. I'm invoking it. She gestured and a holographic display materialized above the courtroom. Hegemony Statute 1.7. All member species retain the right to practice their cultural traditions provided they do not interfere with hegemony interests. What of it? Vexthul's right head snapped. Kretok wasn't spreading human ideology, Chen explained. He was practicing ancient Solari culture, observe. The hologram shifted, displaying historical records. Before the hegemony's arrival, Solari society was built on communal decision-making. Work stoppages weren't rebellion. They were traditional reflection periods where the community would gather to discuss important matters. The concept of individual worth wasn't learned from humans. It's encoded in their oldest religious texts, predating human contact by millennia. Chen walked closer to the magistrate's platform. The prosecution wants you to believe that Kretok learned these ideas from human contamination. But humans didn't invent justice, dignity, or hope. We simply recognize them as universal truths that transcend species. She turned to face the gallery. The hegemony fears these concepts not because they're foreign, but because they're familiar. Every species in this courtroom once believed in their own worth, before they were convinced otherwise. Every civilization here once had leaders who served their people rather than ruling over them. This is propaganda, Zal then protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. This is archaeology, Chen countered, displaying more historical records. Every species currently under hegemony rule has similar traditions in their past. The Zafari had their circles of consensus. The Morganti practiced honor-sharing. The Kethril believed in the sacred worth of all thinking beings. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom as beings throughout the gallery recognized their own forgotten histories displayed before them. The truth, Chen said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, is that Kretok committed no crime. He simply remembered who his people used to be before they were told to forget. She faced the magistrate directly. If practicing one's ancestral culture is now sedition, then every being in this courtroom is guilty. If remembering your people's worth is conspiracy, then memory itself is criminal. If hoping for better treatment is a capital offense, then hope itself must be destroyed. Chen paused, letting her words sink in. The question before this court isn't whether Kretok broke hegemony law. It's whether the hegemony has the right to erase entire cultures to maintain its power. Magistrate Vexthul's three heads were locked in urgent, whispered debate. The gallery buzzed with nervous energy as beings began to remember stories their grandparents had told them, stories they had dismissed as myths. Finally, the center head spoke. The court recognizes the cultural defense presented by the human advocate. The charges of sedition and conspiracy are dismissed. However, the defendant will be restricted to his home world and monitored for future compliance. It wasn't complete victory, but it was unprecedented mercy from a hegemony court. As the courtroom emptied, Kretok approached Chen. Why? He asked simply. Chen smiled. Because justice isn't a human concept, Kretok. It's a universal one. We just refuse to let anyone convince us otherwise. Outside the tribunal, as news of the trial spread across the networks, something remarkable began to happen. On a dozen worlds, beings began to remember. They started telling the old stories again, practicing the old ways, and most dangerously of all, they began to hope. The human had shown them something the hegemony thought buried forever, that justice wasn't given by those in power. It was recognized by those brave enough to demand it.